I wanted to go back and talk a little bit about your agent, and that is Kate McKean. And is it Morhaim Literary Agency?
Yeah.
How did you get hooked up to be represented by her?
That's actually backwards from how most people do, weirdly. Like I had written my YA debut, Archivist Wasp, and I didn't have an agent, and I was shopping it around trying to find an agent. And it was getting rejected a lot, and it was getting rejected mostly for the same reason over and over again, which was that it has a female and male main characters, and that it basically is like an enemies to best friends situation, rather than like there's never any romantic interest, there's never any romance in that book. And I had agents telling me essentially that if I did like a revise and resubmit, adding in a romance or maybe even a love triangle, they would be able to easily see their way to representing it. But as it was, they just weren't going to be able to do it because it was just, teens wouldn't find anything to relate to without a romance, which that's when I got angry. Because obviously teens will find all kinds of things to relate to without romance. I mean, even if they're not asexual or aromantic teens, they still are going to value the friendships in their lives and want to see friendships represented in fiction, I would imagine. And so
they were able to read stories in which that was valued rather than everything.
Exactly. And so even though I had no agent and I had no prospects for an agent, no prospects for publication, I had to stick to my guns with that. And I was like, I will make all kinds of changes to my book because, obviously that's going to happen in edits, and a lot of publishing is compromised, but I am not going to budge on that one thing. I'm not going to add romance into this book because it was a book about friendship. It was a book about strong platonic relationships, and I specifically wrote it that way because it was so hard for me growing up to find books or even movies or really anything that depicted strong platonic relationships between characters of different genders. Like you'd find strong friendships between women, or like you can watch war movies and see like strong relationships between men, or like sports movies, but you don't typically see those outside of those genres. And if there is a relationship depicted between a male and female character, there's going to be like, it's going to turn into romance, or it's going to turn into at least sexual tension, or it's going to come up in the story, even if it doesn't need to. And so I did not budge on that. And I was prepared to like, okay, I'm going to learn how to self-publish, even though I would be terrible at it because I'm not good at marketing. And I was at a ReaderCon one year, which was my favorite con. And I was at dinner with, who was I at dinner with? It was Ellen Kushner and Isabeau Wills. And I had read Isabeau Wills's books, and I really liked them a lot. And I was like fangirling a little bit. And she was asking me what my book was about that I was trying, because it came up that I was trying to find an agent for this book, and I was telling her about it. And she was like, asked to read it. I was like, well, you want to read my book? Of course, please do. And so I sent it to her, and it turns out she really liked it. And she basically told Gavin Grant and Kelly Link at Small Beer Press about it, and I got an email from them saying that they would love to publish my book. And I was like, what? Because I've always loved their books. Like they're fantastic. They put out all kinds of great stuff.
So well past personalized rejections at this point, they're writing you. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I was like, that was out of the blue, and they're so on the level, Gavin and Kelly, that they told me like it would benefit me if I could get an agent so that I could be sure that, I thought the contract was as fair to me as possible. And I was like, okay, but that didn't really work out before.
You had a bad experience with the literary agent previous?
Sorry?
I said you had a bad experience with a literary agent previous?
Just the rejections that I was getting before about how teens would find nothing to relate to in a book that didn't have romance, a YA book.
The contract already, I mean, that has to make agent shopping a little bit easier, right?
Yeah, and I hadn't actually queried Kate before because I think she had been closed to submissions at the time. Someone had recommended her to me, but she was closed. And I didn't know at the time that you could like ask people, like if you know someone who is a client of an agent, you can ask them like, hey, can you put in a good word for me? And like they might look at your book even though they say that they're closed. So I didn't know anything at the time. And so I waited for, by that time she had been, she was open to queries and I hadn't asked her already. So I ran this by her and we ended up thinking that we were a good match. And so, yeah, she's been my agent ever since. So
to go back to one of the agents that passed with your contract and have that Pretty Woman moment where you go back to the board. You work on commission, right?
Yeah. No,
relevant middle grade reference I've made. So
yeah,
I mean, she says yes, and then at what point do you get to where you're consulting her with your story ideas? Because it sounds like she's relatively involved with Jillian, if not other books, right?
Yeah, yeah, she's very hands-on, and I that's one of the things I really love about her. Excuse me. She did like first pass edits on pretty much everything I've sent through her. The thing with Jillian and Take Your Kid to Work Day was I think the one thing that I was like super stumped, and I had a different thing in my query, my kind of like synopsis pitch for this book, and it wasn't as like, it didn't make as much sense as just, hey, it's Take Your Kid to Work Day, they're taking their kid to work. So that was hugely helpful. But yeah, she's very hands-on and she's amazing, and she's been great. But yeah, I kind of ran into her in a very backwards sort of way, and when people ask me how did I got my agent, because I have a number of friends who are having trouble finding agents, and I'm like, I'll tell you, but it's kind of non-standard.
Yeah, that's not the kind of story that inspires hope, I would imagine.
The thing that kills me is that I understand why those agents were saying, this book is unsellable because it's not romance, because like that's what people are conditioned to expect, especially in YA. And I think it's kind of insulting to teens that like in middle grade, there are so many amazing friendships between kids of all genders, and there's never any talk of romance, and like the friendships are deep and beautiful and valid and depicted as valid. And then it's like we're telling kids that as soon as they, graduate from middle grade to YA, then those friendships should be worth less to them. And that, we start giving them stories about how like there'll be a love triangle and the person who didn't get picked still gets to be just friends with the protagonist. And it's like, I think it's damaging, and I think it probably informs a lot of like bad expectations that people have for their relationships in real life, that they will go into them potentially thinking that, if all goes well, maybe this won't be just a friendship. Like friendships are devalued in media aimed at people who are older than like 10 or 12. And that continues through, books aimed at adults or movies aimed at adults. Like there's almost always going to be a romantic interest or sexual tension or whatever. And and like friendships are important too, and they should get page time and they should get screen time. And so I don't blame the agents for saying, hey, you need to write a romance into this or I can't sell it. It's just, it's industry wide, and it's not even just, the book publishing industry. It's cultural. It's just this devaluation and erasure of friendships and platonic relationships. And I wonder sometimes if friendships and platonic relationships were given more value in our fictional media, like would that potentially make concepts like, being friend zoned less prevalent, because people wouldn't expect that like if a relationship is going well, then there's the friendship, which is a stepping stone to like a romantic relationship. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't, like, there's no reason why it should necessarily be. Like people in real life value their friendships with people of all genders, and I don't see why that should be such a hard sell in fiction. You know?
Does seem like we would probably benefit tremendously as a society if we were to put more value into that. I mean, I know from personal experience, when I finally found my wife and said, okay, this is the person I'm going to be with forever, that made making friendships much easier from that point on, because it was always off the table. Like, we don't even have to investigate that possibility, because I'm fully committed. We can just be friends. And not just, how many wonderful friends do I have in my life?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it's a real problem. And I mean, at least subconsciously, like, we culturally draw so much from stories. Just as humans, we draw so much from stories, and we use them to inform real life choices. And it's about how, like, it's just like with anything else that needs more representation. It's if we can see it depicted, then we know how to recognize it and appreciate its validity. So I write friendship books, and I will keep writing friendship books, and with no romance, for all ages. My YA books and my middle grade book and my adult book all are like that, because I want to do whatever I can to just add a few more books to the pile of, you know, books that do that, so that other people who are looking for that kind of relationship to be depicted in their books have another example of something that they can read, where they can see themselves reflected.
Well, you and I are in agreement. Now we just got to get the rest of the world on board.
Yeah.
Which, thankfully, they're listening to this podcast. It's done. Problem solved.